Hi there, and welcome to this episode of the Everyday Millionaire Mindset Matters podcast, where I'm joined by my wife, Olympic mental performance coach, Steffany-Hanlen, Francey. In these episodes, Steffi and I have a conversation about the different aspects of what we refer to as Mindset Matters, because we believe that for those who are awake, we are living in and through the most impactful time in history. Your view of the world is the filter for how you will experience the evolution and changing dynamics of it. Our intention is to provide you with ideas, nutritious food for thought, and some tools that you can use to help you in being your greatest self and living your best life. Listen in, enjoy. Steffany, you're back. Welcome.
Thanks, hon. Well, I'm back in Canada. And we're in Montreal, but I'm back from the Olympic Games.
We are back. So topics, we got a couple things we're going to talk about. Definitely we're going to talk about Olympics, what your experience was in Paris. I'm going to finish the conversation that I started last week around generosity and continuing that conversation. But let's kick it off by talking about Paris. You were at the Olympics, and let's share some insights that you gained in Paris, and give us what are some of the standout things that you noticed about that particular experience?
Well, I think for me, the experience was unique in many ways because it's a Summer Olympic Games, and my sport in ice dance, figure skating, hockey, etc., we're all winter sports. So my Olympics experience has always been in the Winter Games. The reason I was in Paris this year is because 2.5 years ago, the athletes that I coach won a silver medal in the team event in figure skating. The other team that I work with, Japan, won a bronze. Now, here's what happened. There was a doping incident with the Russian athlete, sadly. One of the young girls tested positive for a performance-enhancing drug, so she was eliminated from the games. What that did was stop the medal ceremony. So the athletes that I work with have been waiting 2.5 years, not only to receive their medal, but more importantly, to have the experience of the ceremonies with their friends and families and loved ones. So what the International Olympic Committee did, along with the International Skating Union, is once the verdict came down that the Russians would be third, USA got moved to first and were awarded the gold medal. And Japan was moved to second and were awarded the silver medal. And graciously, the Paris Olympics, the IOC, created an opportunity for them to receive their medals in front of thousands of stands in a beautiful stadium at the Olympic Games, where their friends and family, including myself, Marie-France Dubreuil, and Patrice Lauzon, got to be again awarded with Coach of the Year in the ICOS USA honor. So it was a spectacular and unique experience. Just a little funny aside story. I got to customs here in Montreal the other day, and the guy said, "What were you doing in Paris?" I said, "Well, I'm a coach for the Olympic Games." And he said, "What sport?" And I go, "Figure skating." And he blanks out. He goes, "Figure skating is a summer sport now?" And I said, it's a long story. And if anyone knows me, my life is such a bag of tricks that nothing ever makes sense outside the context. So we really had to own the fact that the athletes were winning. They achieved their goal. They got to experience it in front of everyone. And the IOC and everybody did such a beautiful presentation. Then we had a private ceremony and a private celebration afterwards. And I don't know, I could go on and on, honey. I missed you though.
Yeah, I missed you too. So let's just clean one thing up, for anybody who's listening and heard this whole Russian doping thing and what might have gone on. I think there's something that has to be unpacked there a little bit. And I don't want to go into the details of it because it doesn't really matter. It's only to say this is that when they do their testing, there's a lot of things that could create a flag or a positive test that has nothing to do with illegal drugs or anything else. It could have been anything from a cold drug to some supplement that they're taking as they overstepped and didn't realize that it would show up that way. So I don't know what the details were. It doesn't really matter. The point is that it all got handled. But just so that we don't shine this light on saying, oh God, those darn Russians, there they are, cheating again. It may not have been that, and it doesn't matter. So the point is that you got to celebrate that, and it was 2 years later. So let's just talk a little bit about that, because your U.S. team, who received the gold medal, got to experience of that. Just give us a little bit, because we are talking about Mindset Matters, and what was some of the coaching that you were providing, given that they sat in hold thinking, well, we've won a medal, but we haven't received the medal, and what's going to happen? What is this really? And they got to they then at the time of the Olympics didn't get to experience what the athletes would experience, which is the celebration and the acknowledgement and the kudos and all the things that go with that celebration of that many years of hard work and the fact that they won the gold. So give us a little bit of background of what that really kind of meant.
Well, as you can imagine, 2022 Beijing Olympics, they're all known now as the COVID Olympics. So in a sense, it was a benefit for them to have waited this long. We just didn't know when they were going to get the medal or when the ISU and the International Olympic Committee were going to come down with these verdicts. To your point, we don't know the truth. Nobody knows the truth. All we know is when they did the math, US got first, Japan were second, Russia still maintained third. They'll get their bronze medal in the mail. Unfortunately, Canada's bid to get the bronze medal didn't go through. And I think that says a lot to your point, is that we don't always know. And the other athletes that were on the team, we don't know if they were doping, and why would they then have their medal stripped away? So that was part of the mindset conversation that I was having this whole time with my ice dancers, Maddie Chalk, Evan Bates, Madison Hubble, and Zachary Donahue, as well as Tim Coletto and Masato, and I can never say her last name, sorry, sweetie, from Japan, Combat Sumasura, I believe. And the conversations that I'd been having with them since the Beijing Olympics were about, the goal hasn't changed. Yes, you didn't get your celebration, but we will complete. And in the meantime, these are the things that we need to do to move us forward. So you're not living in the past and living in the regret or living in the victimhood of not receiving your medal. So what Evan did, and he's part of the, Evan Bates, part of the ISU athlete committee, they came up with a theory going, it's not about the medal. Now, the fight that they did, they went to the doping commissions and they said, it's not about the medal. It's about clean sport. It's about the things that we do as athletes to have the celebration with our families. It's about having the acknowledgement. So athletes work their entire lives to have a shot at the Olympic Games, never mind a shot at receiving a medal. So the mindset through the last 2.5 years that I had the privilege of coaching them around was, how do we delay gratification? How do we still live in the moment, compete at each and every competition on the way, knowing that the completion and the celebration was going to show up, but it was also the unknown. And I also say always, we can plan and we can make preparations and we can be extremely prepared for whatever we need to do, but we always have to leave 10% room for the magic. And that's what happened, is that as long as they left that room for the magic, there was a trust. There was a trust in their coaching staff. There was trust in the process. And I think that was one of the biggest things that I learned, was the trust in the process had to be so grounded in the fact that there's an unknown. We didn't know it was going to happen. They were actually suggesting to do it in 2026 in Milan, but that would have taken away the thunder of the new champions, because the entire US team, except for Madison and Evan, have retired. So there wasn't going to be a redo. So the fact that it happened in 2024 at the Paris Games, and the Paris Olympic Committee and ISU opened that space, we didn't know that was going to happen. But we didn't shut down. We didn't live in the past. We didn't live in regret. There was no victim conversation allowed. All we knew is that we were going to have the moment. They were going to have the moment where somebody was going to put the medal around their neck, regardless. We had to stay true to that. And that's what we anchored through this entire last 2.5 years since Beijing in 2022.
And you got to give Olympic Committee credit for the fact that they set it up brilliantly. I think you guys were on stage at the base of the
Eiffel Tower.
So that was really cool. And it was a big stage. There was a significant crowd that showed up. I mean, it was a really big deal. They celebrated it well. And it got, and based on the pictures you sent and all the rest of it that we saw, I mean, certainly there was a big celebration. The athletes looked to feel very honored through the whole process. And I think that was really great. And then that comes back to conversations that you and I have had on many podcasts around completion and the fact that there was now completion. And it is really to say, to your point, we don't live in the past. We got completion. Now we can go on to what's next. And in some cases, again, it's what's next for some athletes is retirement. For what's next for some athletes is, okay, we're back at it. We're continuing the journey and we're going to try it one more time, whatever that scenario might be. It's that kind of an accurate recap.
100%. And as you speak, it actually makes me think of the time that we were having conversations about You can only be as complete as you can be in the moment. There are going to be external things happening, but you as an individual, me as an individual, have to be as complete as we can be. Are you going to express some frustration and anger? Absolutely. But are you going to live there? No. Use your journal, use your tools, use the skills, and understand that as you continue to move forward and trust the process, this too shall pass. But the other thing when it comes to stress and the being able to fold in this conversation about mindset is this too shall prepare me. And everything that we do when it comes to the champion's journey is about preparing for the what's next. You can plan, you can prepare, you can do, like Glenn Sather said, piss poor planning leads to piss poor performance. But we plan the heck out of everything, leave that 10% for the magic, and let's see what's going to happen. Keep our hearts open, keep our minds positive, keep the work going, stay in shape, do whatever you need to do to move your life forward. And that, I believe, is when Providence steps in and life happens in the way that you want it to unfold. And that's what happened in this last 2.5 years for myself, for my coaching team, for the athletes that we talk about. And it really is proof positive that mindset is truly, they say, what do they say all the time? 90% is 90% and physical is 10%. Well, the fact that we're training the 90%, I think shows a lot that we're moving this sport forward. And I think we're also, as we link it to business and individual development, that this works.
Well, there's a lot that shows up in what you just said is that, when we talked recently about the adversity quotient and the work that we did with Paul Stoltz over the years, what is your AQ? What is your adversity quotient? And I think it really, shone a light on it. This is a big deal for these athletes. We have to understand and appreciate the fact that they've worked their whole life to get a medal, and then to be at the Olympic Games and not be able to receive a medal because of the controversy and am I gold, am I silver? Those are big deals. That's a difference. Those are big differences. And so in the scope or in the context of adversity, how do you face adversity? It could have had, number one, you could have been a victim to it. It could have been a story that you just replayed. So it had lots of reach. It affected everything that you did through those past 2 years. As a matter of fact, after a couple of years, it becomes your identity if you hang on to that story. If every time you're having a conversation or an interview, especially in an athlete who has some media attention, if your whole focus is this constant story about how you got robbed of the medal or you're not sure or there's some drama around it, it doesn't speak well. So I think that resistance, that adversity is what prepares you for the future. It actually gives you that strength or that understanding, that mental capacity to get through those kinds of things. So I love the story around that and the lessons that we can learn from the experience of the athletes that you've worked with and the fact that you ultimately got to complete around it. And now they are complete. They can now continue to step forward. They're not carrying anything forward with them other than the excitement or the confidence that they've done it once. Perhaps they can do it again in some cases.
Well, I think too, what's happening, they're going to be stepping into the power of what I always call the now what, because some of them, like you say, are retired, moving on to other things in their life, but there was a real big pause. And they had put their lives on hold for this. And now that it's happened, are they prepared? And I really, truly believe that in order to do the work and to be prepared for the what's next, you have to be very present and living in the now. And I know that sounds kind of airy-fairy, but that's the truth. And had I allowed them to live in the past and be victims and, beat their chest about what they were robbed from and for, I think it would have been very dramatically different experience for all of us in Paris, because we were invited by the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee and the U.S. figure skating. They invited us 3 coaches to be there for them. So they understood the bigger picture. And the coaching that we were given was, just to be present, don't bring up the controversy, just be present and excited and grateful. And that, again, aligns with our work. It also aligns with a piece of the champion's journey that we talk about. And this exercise is called the incident. And I invite our listeners, if they want to play along in this game. And the incident in my world was this doping scandal and all of the sadness for the Russian athletes and for our athletes and for sport in general to be going through this. And I call it the exercise, the incident. You get to discover and define who you were before something happened. Let's say it was an accident, a broken leg, an illness, a death, something. There's an incident that happens in our life. So there's our lives and who we are before the incident, then the incident, and then there's who we are after the incident. Now, the journey is to become and create who you're going to be and how you're going to show up after the incident, and how do you bring the lessons forward, whether positive or negative, good or bad, whatever, however you define that. But what I'm noticing in many of the languaging of the people that I work with is they want to talk about who they were before the accident and who they were after. So instead of living on that teeter-totter or that swing, that pendulum swing, what I try and get them to do is to honor the incident and pull the lessons, whether they're positive or negative lessons, into the future. Because if we're living in the past and saying, well, I was this way, I was in really good shape before the incident, I was a much better athlete before the incident, I was a great mom, I was a great dad, I was a this, or I was a that before the incident. And then the incident is what stops them. And then there's no future. So it's a regurgitation and a recycle of who I used to be. Like, I used to be that super hot girl in high school. And then what? So the incident exercise, if you choose to do it, is about writing down and tell the truth about how many significant incidences you've had in your life, positive or negative, who you thought you were before that. Consider the positive and negative outcomes of what that incident has brought to you. And I think what many people don't realize is that there's always a high after a low, and there's always a low after a high. And I know that's what I'm going to be dealing with some of the athletes after this medal ceremony, because it was such a high, so many highs this year for our athletes. So we're going to be dealing with the low. Now, my gift is to bring them back to the incident, whether it's a wedding or whether it's a funeral or whether it's a medal ceremony, to pull the positives, but also create a collapse of what didn't go well, what did go well, what didn't go well, and then neutralize it. And that exercise can be done for any area of your life. It could be before the birth of a baby, after the birth of the baby, and just understand when our lives go through these glorious or sometimes not so glorious transitions, those moments in time, if you just frame it as an incident or a situation or an occurrence and not put so much energy on it so that you're forced to live in the past and that you want to ignore what you're creating, or it's too painful to look into the future without your spouse or without the job or without whatever's going on. So just a little aside, it's a very powerful exercise called the incident.
I love that. Yeah, no, I think that's great. So just because I want to catch it while it's still fresh in your memory, I mean, you're in an environment of world-class athletes based on what I saw. And of course, when we debriefed a little bit, and even Marie-France showing me pictures of the venue. And so the environment was amazing, and you have world-class athletes everywhere. You yourself are a coach who's kind of in the inner circle of what goes on in that world. You know, what was was there any takeaways? And what I want to say is that, so you've been to dozens and dozens of world and Olympic class kind of events. I mean, there's only so many Olympics every 4 years, but my point is that you've been in a lot of really competitive, high-end kind of competitions, if you will. And so when you get yourself into that environment, and are you looking, and what do you see as, or what are maybe some of your observations of those around you, given how I am in terms of your program or the Ice Academy in Montreal, for example, what you guys do, the environment, the culture that you create versus what you see. Do you learn from that? I don't know what the question is. Was there something there that you would take away that you noticed?
I think I'm hearing what you're saying. I come at it when I'm watching sport. People don't like watching sport with me because I'm not only just watching the actual event, I'm watching the coach and the athlete interaction. I'm watching the competitors. I'm watching how the media shows up. I'm watching all of the entire hologram around the actual event. And that's, I think, what many of the takeaways was for me, is that how I prepare an athlete and how we prepare an athlete in our world is to be really present, to understand their strengths, understand that they worked hard to get there, to be grateful, and to use the tools and trust your training. And I know that sounds simplistic, but when I was watching a couple of the events, and I had the privilege of actually speaking to a coach of one of the athletes that we were watching one night in the track and field realm, and watching her body language after she completed a couple of her events. And really was able to hear the coach afterwards, and his disappointment is how she didn't trust her training, how she went into some bit of a story of the past of how she used to do things, and the disappointment in the body language and how she shifted when she didn't have a first great qualifying round. Now, the reason I say that was because the training has been over the last 25 years in some cases for some of the athletes. And in that moment under stress, whether it's a 2-second, a 10-second, or a 2-hour marathon, is can they trust their training? And if they can't, why not? And that's where I like to dig in and watch. And as I was watching some of the athletes after they'd had a great show or they'd had a not so great show, is how they interacted with the coaches and what the coaches' energy was alike around them. Some of the coaches would buy into the negativity or the being down, and some of them were very uplifting. And I think it's in those moments where we get to grow beyond ourselves as coaches and not make it about us. And my friend who's a coach of this particular track athlete didn't make it about him. It was amazing. All he did was make it about her and how she could have stepped up differently, who she was being and how she reacted. He didn't make it about him. He knew he'd done everything that he could to provide all the coaching, and she had all the tools, and he had to hand it over to her. The disappointment, the noticing, was that she was not able to compete at the level that everybody knows she could compete at. So the interaction afterwards was private. He didn't do it publicly. He didn't do it in front of, millions of people on television. He waited until it was done. And I really appreciated that. On the other hand, what I did see was some coaches really getting negative when their athletes didn't perform to the level that they know they could. And that was really hard to see because it was all about them. And then the other side was when an athlete was, just experienced a world or Olympic medal and how everybody got so excited, not just their coach and family, but the entire 60 or 65,000 people in the audience. So we're also attached to how people react to our performances. But in the case of Ice Academy Montreal and what I do in my mindset coaching is all of what's happening externally is none of your business. If you're doing there the best you can, trusting your training, focused on yourself, not living in the past, not living in the future, but really embracing and being grateful and looking around and letting all in and finding your flag or whatever it is that creates that anchor for you to perform to your highest level. And then when you go out there, you can be fully responsible for what it is that you did, positive or negative. One of the things I always say to my skaters when they want to give me credit for all the great things in their lives, which they tend to do that. They tend to do that with their coaches, or they tend to give away credit. And I receive it graciously with honor, but I give it back to them because I say, this is your moment. You're the one that's done the work. I'm not going to be on the podium with you or getting the medal around my neck. If you're going to give me credit for your success, the hook is that you're also going to give me credit for your failure. So when it comes to high performance, whether it's in business or in life or in sport, it's really honoring the fact that when you're up there doing a presentation, you're up there doing a medal winning performance or a song or something that you're out there performing in the world, is that if you're fully prepared and you're trusting your training, you can lean back on that, lean back on the coaching that you've done, on the support you've had over the years. Because, many times when you see a world-class athlete, whether it's a hockey player or an actor at the Academy Awards, and they're receiving their award, some of them appreciate their coaches, which I'm really grateful that our athletes do. But in certain moments, the first person they thank is their family. Thank God or Jesus Christ. They have a process that they go through where they can link to who was sort of the most instrumental. And I was surprised actually in Paris that we were called up on stage, Patch Murray and I, to receive the Order of Ecos again in front of, 1,000 people at USA House. So it was a huge honor, but it was done in such a way. And the way that the athletes presented it is that we are part of their support team. We're not the reason they're standing there, which I found a very big distinction.
I think it is important. And that comes, I think, too, from maturity of athletes or actually development of athletes, which is to say that, they're the front center. They're going for the medal, but they don't do it alone, which is just, again, back to what you said, which is the gratitude for the fact that behind the scenes there are people supporting their journey. And yes, they are the pointy end of the spear, but they're not doing it alone. And I love that whole concept and context. That's what's so awesome about this particular, any team sport, but certainly any individual sport is that the individual looks like the only show in town, but behind it was years of commitment by people around them. So that's interesting. The next part of this conversation is that the expectation of what was going on, because you made a really interesting point, which was if you were looking at what was happening in Paris and social media, you know that there was definitely a lot of, France melting down, but Paris specifically, apparently there was riots in the streets in some parts of Paris. I don't know what that was, but a lot of controversy around it. But you were there in reality, boots on the ground in the trenches, and Paris was pretty quiet. There wasn't any of that happening. Now, whether they, doubled the guard, if you will, to shut things down, or if it just was never happening, we don't really know. So then it becomes a case of, gosh, as much as we look to social media and we see what's going on, we just don't know what to believe anymore. And I think that was an interesting takeaway from all of it, is the reality of, as much as we see what's going on social media, what is real and what's not real.
Oh, you bring up such a good point, Hun, because when I got there, I was really nervous because I had seen what was happening, and the homeless people and the restaurants were empty and streets were filthy dirty and the garbage people were on strike. And I'm like, oh no, what is it we're putting these athletes into? This is horrible. What is going on? So I just opened my heart, got on the plane. I was going to go and do my work with my athletes and my colleagues, and we were just going to have our own completion experience, regardless of what was happening externally. And that's how we do everything, right? You and I, that's how we do everything. We're going to step into the truth of what is. We have to can deal with that what isness of anything. So we got to Paris and checked into our Airbnb, and, we had no problem getting taxis or Ubers. The streets were clean. We didn't have any problem getting into restaurants, but it's not like they were empty. So a lot of the things that they were seeing on social media were just not true. And maybe just because I was seeing it through my own filters, which I truly believe I create my reality. So that's an aside, and we could do another podcast on that. But ultimately, as we worked through the day, every single day was a creation of what it was for us, what I wanted it to be for me. So as I looked through my lens, I didn't see homeless people. I saw one homeless lady. I saw many people, helping other people. I saw a lot of gendarmes, a lot of the police out there, crowd control, but lots of them would end up getting pulled into the stands and dancing with the fans. I mean, there was a lot of very interesting experiences that we had that didn't have anything to do with this debacle of an opening ceremony that many people really had a hard time with because they felt it was very disrespectful to Christianity, for example. But what I realized when I got there and people were explaining to me is that this opening ceremonies was all about Paris. It wasn't even about France. It wasn't even about the athletes. What they had done, because the person that paid for most of it is the owner of Louis Vuitton. And so they said they were going to bring the focus around really healing and bringing the attention to Paris as a city, and through that to France. So everything that you saw on the opening ceremonies that could have offended you really was done through a filter of what Paris's experience is, Paris's history, not necessarily the history of France. And the downside, and where they did apologize, was they didn't make it about the athletes. And I think that, to me, is taking responsibility was good. It wasn't a great start to the games, but I don't think it really cast a shadow on the experience as from the athlete standpoint or from the fans. There was people from all over the world. We met people, we talked to people. Everybody's heart was open. We were laughing and dancing and singing and eating great food and drinking great wine, at the same time as honoring these beautiful athletes and the work that they put in for the last 12, 15 years, however long it took to get themselves to this particular ceremony. So the lesson I learned from that, and I am a little bit guilty sometimes when I'm doom scrolling from that 15 minutes I give myself in the morning, is to not buy into it, is to know that, the algorithms are going to show you what you want to see. But the ultimate algorithm is your brain and your heart, and to make sure that you stay present, see what it is that you want to see. Don't buy into what's going on around you, the fear mongering and the doom scrolling and all the things that are happening. We still have a beautiful world and a beautiful life. And I'm not rose-colored glasses girl. I don't live under a mushroom. I know what's happening politically and economically, but I also know, and I'm going to commit to, and as always, is to the growth and development and the journey that we're all on. Doesn't matter how hard it is, because I know the journey of an athlete is as hard or harder than it is as a journey as a mother or as a business person or whatever it takes. So this just confirmed and really solidified in my mind and my heart that the work that we do, you and I, in our coaching business, for example, is still so very, very important.
Okay, so thank you for that whole recap. Now I want to just touch on, as before we wind down, is that so while you were away and I missed you, and so I had to do the dreaded monologue podcast on my own. Dreaded for me. Hopefully my listeners or our listeners, they'll go, oh my gosh, I can hardly wait till Steffany's back. Maybe they do say that. Anyways, so the topic was generosity, and you and I had talked about generosity and having that topic before you left, and the reality or our experience of when we are nature to be generous, and that gets normalized, and then what starts to happen. And what starts to happen is it becomes an expectation as opposed to, oh, they're being generous. No, that becomes the expectation. One thing I didn't bring up, and as you and I kind of just touched base briefly before we even jumped on this, we wanted to touch on one fundamental thing, which is that when you're generous by nature and that does become an expectation or that does become normalized, what happens ultimately is that can lead to resentment. And that's the one thing that I didn't complete on. So when we think about that aspect of it, I think that's where we have to, where I got to in the podcast when I was actually speaking of it, was that we have that outside of ourselves. So whether it be staff or people we know, we're generous, and then that becomes normal. But on the other side of that, that's where ultimately it leads, and it can lead to resentment and the realization that that's often where relationships can break down. So you listen to the podcast. Is there anything that you want to expand on to complete it?
Yeah, I did listen to it while I was in Paris, and I really appreciate the fact that how much courage it takes to do that by yourself. And you mentioned in the podcast that when you don't have that person to bounce things off of, because one of the things that really inspired the generosity conversation was that when there's a cycle, there's a process from when you're a giver, like you said on the podcast, there's no giving without receiving. But sometimes when the giver keeps giving and there's no follow-up or gratitude or acknowledgement, that's what normalizes it, right? Then it keeps going. And then maybe if you pull back a little bit with your generosity, it's the person that you've been generous to that feels resentment.
Yes.
They get angry because you've pulled that, whatever that love in their experience or generosity or energy away from them. So they're feeling rejected. So that's where the resentment piece comes in. And I want you to notice the cycle is if you're the person that's being overly generous, and all of a sudden the person that you're giving to is taking things for granted, and you notice it. And then you go, whoa, just let me slow down here a bit. And you pull back a tiny bit. It's in that gap where people feel resentment. And that's when they go, well, obviously the relationship is breaking down, or they're not good people anymore. They've changed so much. It's not that. So the healing of that, what I've learned is that I can try to neutralize my generosity because, like you said on the podcast, it's our natural way of being. I love giving. Because I know that the more I give, I don't know if it's a karma thing or whatever, but I just love the feeling. But I also allow people in return to give back to me. And then I acknowledge that piece of it. And that's where I think it neutralizes, and that friendships can stay long lasting, relationships can stay long lasting when you allow the other person to give back to you. If the person is giving to you with a hook, then that's not generosity. That's an expectation, which you covered really well. But what the piece was that I thought was really important, and we discussed even today, because I can link it back to my just recent Paris experience, is that there's a way that sometimes I feel not worthy of all of the greatness and the amazingness that the Ice Academy Montreal, you and the people around us, like I just feel sometimes so not worthy of all of that. But then it takes some time for me to wind it back and go, yeah, I am worthy. I do give. I do give without a hook. But I also know that what I do I deserve to be well paid for. In the work side of it, I don't overgive to get approval anymore, which is what I used to do based on the conversation that you had about me going to lunch with my girlfriends and them still expecting me to pay half. It was such a wide and a big awareness that it just made me laugh when you said it. But it's true. And based on the self-worth that you have, knowing that when people are being generous, that you are worthy of that, and that in turn, if you have the ability to reciprocate, and not in kind. If I give you $100, you don't have to give me $100 back. But that's not what it's about. It's about, is there a context of generosity in your value system? And if there is, and you can give without the hook, you can give without needing expectation, but just knowing that something's going to come around the corner and that piece of you will be fulfilled. The people that I find that I'd be generous to sometimes, and I get a little bit over generous, again, I pull back, they get pissed off at me, they get resentful, and then I'm a bad person. There's nothing I can do about that. All I can do is say, you know what? I love you anyway.
I think there's a couple parts to it too that we don't want to step over. Is some of the resentment becomes when generosity turns into an expectation, but then turns into dependency. So ultimately, you talk about the $100. So it's like, grandkids, you give them, you give them a couple bucks or whatever. And then every time you see them, they expect that couple bucks. So that's all fine. They're just kids growing up. But at the end of the day, the example is that it soon turns into a expectation. But ultimately, that can turn into a dependency. And then all of a sudden, oh, well, hold it. Grandpa and grandma always give me X amount of dollars. And so I'm depending on that X amount of dollars to buy my next whatever that might be. Well, if you take that into adult life and you're doing something that supports somebody and you're doing it from a place of generosity, and then it has this expectation, then it becomes a dependency. And the resentment lives in the dependency when the dance step changes. And I think that's a kind of all these little subtle nuances. The point for me was in it all, what it really drove me or created for me was to reflect and go, okay, God, I can see that on the other side of it, but where am I guilty of that? Over the years of being supported so often by so many different people, I think there's probably a place where it became the expectation for me. And in probably some regards, dependent. And I'm going to continue to think through it because those are blind spots. They're hard to uncover those, but I'm just curious about it right now. I think that there's a couple of relationships that I might be able to heal some wounds or whatever the case. And I'm just taking responsibility for that. That's my only thought process around that. So as we wind down, because we've already gone a little bit longer than we normally would, but we had lots to talk about it. Gosh, Paris.
Yeah, right.
So that's pretty cool. Anything that we need to complete on, we will be doing a shift program or a champion journey. We'll be doing something probably late September, early October. We'll start pushing that out. If you're interested in being on the list to receive some insights into what we're doing and what we're planning, send an email to ceo@reincanada.com, ceo@reincanada.com. If you're interested in hearing more, we'll be running a weekend program that'll be kind of that whole Friday night, all day Saturday, Sunday kind of an event. It'll be probably in British Columbia. We don't know all the details yet, but if you're interested in hearing more, definitely do that. And any words of wisdom that you want to share as we kind of check out before we sign off?
I missed you too. I think the biggest one is in my life when I notice there's an imbalance, and I invite our listeners to go, okay, where is there an imbalance? Is there somebody I feel I'm being overly generous or generous to that I'm not feeling the gratitude coming back? Just don't cut them off. Don't just, cut the relationship. Enter the conversation and ask why they've maybe cut off the generosity or cut off a certain way of being. Like our house is an open house. Like the pool is always open in the summer. The barbecue's always on. The door is always open. The dogs are always ready for a walk. But then sometimes we have to say, no, today we're closed. And then that might hurt somebody and go, well, just a minute, is that rejection? It isn't. It's in the context of how you see balancing out relationships, because they always do balance out. And I trust that. I always trust that whatever goes around comes around, and I'm never a victim, and I'm never seeing an out of balance experience if I'm being generous. I guess the nugget is notice in your own life if there's an imbalance where you've been more of a taker potentially in certain environments and maybe people are pulling away from you, or you're being more of a giver and people are glomming onto you. And if you're trying to cut it like cold turkey, there could be some hard feelings. So that's it.
That's it. Cool. And as I'm sitting here, I just realized while you were away, I did a in-person podcast, The Everyday Millionaire, and I did it, really poolside studio. We did it outdoors, poolside. And so here I am today on Mindset Matters. I'm poolside, right there.
At the Ritz-Carlton.
At the Ritz-Carlton.
Oh my gosh.
That's cool.
That's very cool.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks, Steffany. And we'll talk next week again.
Awesome. Look forward to it. That was fun.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. If you found value in the podcast, please take the time to rate and review and share with others. Share with your friends. As it is my goal to always improve and to provide the highest value for you, the listener. If you have any comments, suggestions, or questions you'd like answered, please email me at ceo@reincanada.com. That's ceo@reincanada.com. I look forward to hearing from you. And until next time, Patrick out.